So the next part of our session this morning is our panel and keynote from Emma King. Emma has been Chief Executive since 2014 of Victorian Council of Social Services, providing a strong voice of leadership and advocacy on social justice issues for the community sector. Emma was previously Chief Executive Officer of the Early Learning Association Australia, formerly Kindergarten Parents Victoria, the peak organisation representing parents and providers of early learning services in Victoria. Emma has an extensive background in the public sector and in workforce education issues, having worked as a Victorian policy advisor, a teacher in a range of industrial and training roles at the Victorian Independent Education Union and the Finance Sector Union. Emma's qualifications include a Masters in Industrial and Employee Relations, a Graduate Diploma of Education and a Bachelor of Arts. Emma is Chair of the Future Social Service Institute and sits on a number of committees and advisory groups, including the Family Violence Steering Committee, NDIS Implementation Ministerial Task Force, and Roadmap to Reform Implementation Ministerial Advisory Group. My goodness, and we were very lucky to secure her this morning because we know that she's a very busy woman, and we were very grateful for you, Emma, for being able to be our keynote to provide the segue for the panel discussion that will follow you. So please welcome Emma King to the stage to provide our 2018 AGM keynote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Scott. I hope I can live up to expectations. If I can begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Ratnam people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge Scott, to acknowledge the politicians who are going to be on our panel, Gabriel Williams, Fiona, Patten, McLeish, and of course everyone in the room in terms of the incredible work that you do. I think when it comes to volunteering is very much part of the Australian psyche, which is partly why it's so fantastic to see so many of you gathered here today. I think we're people that get involved, we lend a hand and we make things happen, and we know that better than anyone. Whether it's a local netball club, whether it's volunteering at your local neighbourhood house, or whether it's on a not-for-profit board, I know we see people volunteering in so many different ways, and this is borne out in the statistics. So just shy of 1 million people volunteer in Victoria, including according to the most recent census. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. And the analogy I was given in the office, I'm not sure that I love 60 Minutes, but it's more people than who watch 60 Minutes on a Sunday night. But perhaps more important than our desire to help is our willingness to work together, and that's to collaborate. And I want to talk more about that, because they say that many hands make light work, which is true, but as we know, it certainly isn't the case if people are pulling in very different directions. I think we're at our best when we're most united, we're coordinated, and we're really working for the common good. And it's something I think I feel particularly proud in our sector about, that working for the common good and what makes a just society and what makes a good society. I know that's the thing that constantly drives me every single day in my work. And when I stand in a room like this, I know that's actually a mission that actually is core to everything that we do. And it's true as well on a smaller scale when it comes to individuals, but also when we take a broader view. And I think as a CEO of VCOSS, in terms of being the peak body for Victoria's community and social sector, I'm privileged to see firsthand how different sections of the community collaborate together to drive real change. And I wanted to give 3 examples from VCOSS's advocacy work, just to speak to this a little bit more, because it goes not only to the work that VCOSS does, but it goes very much to the work that we do with a range of different members from our community and a range of our different member organisations as well. So the first example that I wanted to give is our Stronger Schools campaign. So we launched this with a range of people not long ago, and it's about a campaign for a truly inclusive school system. Many of our schools are diverse, they're respectful, they're accessible, and they're genuinely affordable. Sounds like a no-brainer, but actually, unfortunately for many people, that don't quite match up at the moment, as you would know. The campaign group we have around this comes out of what we call the Education Equity Alliance. And it's a group that's come together that includes principals and principal representatives, teachers, parents, students, community sector organisations, including disability advocacy organisations, And I wanted to point out one thing that might not seem as obvious out of that as well, and that is that it includes West Justice as one of the members. And I point to that because I think when you look at a Stronger Schools Alliance, it might not seem particularly obvious that you'd actually have a group of lawyers who are represented in that Stronger Schools Alliance. But it's really important because we know that when kids get disengaged or when they're in trouble, actually it's the lawyers who then, or the community legal centres in particular, that often, along with schools and along with everyone else, work to pick up the pieces. Because when kids from less affluent backgrounds get caught fare evading because they can't afford to top up their marquee card, or it's the lawyers who stop them from drowning in the system. So it's really important actually that we've got a broad group, and it's because we're all part of a community that we've got to help one another. It's because we're part of a collective that we have the strongest impact. And rather than focus on what we don't agree on, which would be really easy to sit in a room and say the principals agree on one thing and the students might be agreeing on something else, it's actually about how we're most effective when we join together and when we campaign together. And I think that's what I feel particularly proud of out of that group. And I know when we were heading into the most recent election, we're particularly concerned about the cost of education for students. One of the things that was really exciting for me was having, whether it be principals, parents, etc., constantly phoning me up and saying, I've just spoken to X, I've been able to tell them that this is the thing that makes a difference for us, and it meant that whichever political party it was, whomever they were speaking to, irrespective across the spectrum, they were getting the same messages. And I'm sure the MPs who are present here today can tell you there is nothing less helpful than if you've got groups of people coming to you with 7 different asks from one sector. What are you meant to do with that? So it's about our role in terms of looking at how do we organise and how do we work out what we agree on. The second example I wanted to give is something I feel tremendously proud of with the rest of the sector, and that is around the new series of rental laws that recently passed Parliament. Now, the new rental laws is something that our sector has been advocating on well before my time at VCOSS, and it's a number of housing organisations and tenancy organisations who've been involved around core things like minimum standards in properties, and really providing a basic set of rental standards overall. And when I was thinking about that as another example as well, I wanted to point out the fact that one of the core member organisations that was involved in that is Domestic Violence Victoria. And again, in many ways, they may not seem like an obvious fit in the coalition because they're obviously focused very much around domestic violence, around issues that are particular to gender, and about behaviour change. And it's interesting to think, so, you know, why would they then become involved in issues that are about tenancy and that are about rental rights? And it's because women fleeing from violence often have to break a lease with very little notice. It's because women fleeing violence need to have a property with a door that locks. And something that actually, while it sounds ridiculous, that actually wasn't in place under the previous laws. And it's because for people who are fleeing family violence, they've often got the family pet in tow as well, whether that's their dog or their cat, etc. And that makes a huge difference when it comes to their family. So domestic violence became a very key voice in the push for minimum rental standards and key to the change to the rental laws. So I wanted to give that as an example, partly because it was also that our advocacy work in that space was very much about the long game. So this started, as I said, years and years ago. I suspect there's probably about 15 years that's been in the go. And there are some things that if you like are quick wins, and there are some that are longer. And it's about how we all collectively keep that voice and are mindful of when the opportunities come along that we take them. And for us, no one social issue, it's not one-dimensional. It's actually about the fact that we're all in this together and that we've all got a different role to play. And I think while that legislation was being played out, we were really mindful about who was best placed to do what. So there were some core things that VCOSS was best placed to do. There were others that our other member organisations were best placed to do. But in terms of the whole piece around actually how do we have this legislation passed, because we know that that is what is going to drive a very real and a very significant change to every person who is renting a property in Victoria. So I feel really thrilled about that because if I look at the community sector at its best, I would use that as one of the examples. The last example that I wanted to point to is in terms of the collective pieces. It was one that we haven't yet had success in, but we're very much hoping to, and I'll chat to the politicians in the room while they're here. It's a campaign called Access Sport. So we're currently lobbying Victorian government and obviously all of the parties in the lead up to the election around having a concession scheme so that kids through experiencing poverty are able to play weekend sport. for any of us who've got our kids enrolled, and I know at the start of term 3, all of the bills come in with having a netballer and a dancer and a whole host of other things. It all comes in at once, and you can ask, well, why is VCOSS doing that work? Because we're not a sporting organisation. And what's the thinking? But the thinking is actually, we know that basically, if you look at the stats, if you're from a well-off background, 3/4 of kids who can afford to play sport on the weekend play. If you look at kids who are from a concession card background, less than 50% of them are involved in weekend sport. So it actually becomes a no-brainer about saying, well, how do we help everyone who wants to play sport, everyone who wants those great health outcomes, kids may not realise about the great health outcomes, but we know that they're going to do better in school, we know that they're going to be healthier, we know they're going to be better engaged in their community. It's a no-brainer. It exists in other states. New South Wales was about $220 to every student, or to everyone, I should say, who was on a concession card to help them play sport. So we're working again with a really different coalition around Big Health and others and our member organisations to say this matters and this is why it matters, because actually every single child in our state should be able to play weekend sport. It's just a no-brainer. So we're involved because we believe in helping communities and we believe in a fair go. And you shouldn't be able to, every time I walk into that netball centre, I have to say I feel enraged that I have to pay to get through the door. I have to pay again for my daughter who's already paid the $350 to pay for the season as well, let alone the cost of the uniform and everything else. And think, well, actually, if you had no money, how do you get through the door? Because actually you can't. So we want to make sure that every child can play sport. So you'll be hopefully seeing more from us on that front. So I gave those examples really to point out that, to remind us of one thing, and that is that we're all part of the whole, and it's about what we do together. On a slightly different note, but related to that as well, is around our recent report, which is entitled Jobs of the Future. So if you type that phrase into Google, I think probably what you would find is either robots or men in high-vis, outfits. But you're wrong on both fronts, because if you were to do that, although people in this room actually probably know better, I'm preaching to the converted here, and that is that the real jobs of the future are actually in social care and the health services. So there's a real shift in terms of in terms of when we think overall around the shift with the NDIS, when we think about the shift in terms of growth of the aged care industry, when we think about domestic violence and when we think about childcare. And there's a graph we'll put up at the moment. I don't know whether I'm just doing the stats if you're audio. So if you look at that graph, it's incredibly compelling evidence about where the jobs of the future are. So we're constantly in the ear of every political party talking about, this is your boom industry, healthcare and social assistance. And it's very different to the industries of the past. So if you want to talk about jobs or traineeships or skills, you need to be talking about social care and you need to be talking about health assistance as well. And one of the challenges we've got in this area is that these are roles that traditionally have been highly gendered, they haven't been particularly valued, they haven't been particularly well paid, and there's really, it's pretty hard to get regular hours of work in these sectors as well. So if you're looking at your jobs in the future, what are the things that you need to wrap around that to make these good jobs, and actually how does that help prevent poverty and disadvantage in our community in the first place? Because if your future of your job is there, which it is, we literally need to make them good jobs. And the reason I rely on that, I'm pointing to this data as well, is because these jobs are embedded very deeply in the community sector and the community organisations, which rely very heavily on the passion and the generosity of volunteers. You are so key to nurturing in this industry. So to be very specific, about 87% of community sector organisations, which is well over 4,000 organisations, are supported by unpaid workers, the work that everyone in this room does. So combined, these organisations, which include community groups, health support networks, emergency relief organisations, engage about 448,000 volunteers. It's phenomenal when you think about it. And when you look at that growth and you think about what is that going to mean when we work alongside this sector and this exponential growth. When we first, I'll chop on that in a moment. So my key point here is I don't think it's overstating to say that volunteers are the social fabric of our community, the social fabric of the Victorian community overall. And our anticipated growth is going to need to be met very much by well-managed and sustainable increase in volunteer hours as well. So it's a really interesting challenge, I think, for all of us about what does that look like as we move forward. And this very much means consulting with and amplifying the voices of volunteer-run organisations. And it's increasingly core business for VCOSS in the very same way, or walking alongside Volunteering Victoria itself. So as I said earlier, we are all very much in this together. An immediate example of the role is in the data I quoted just a moment ago, and that is 87% of Victorian sector organisations are supported by unpaid workers. And the reason we know that figure is because of the ACNC data, which is putting out a report each year, and I'd like to acknowledge Sue Woodward, who worked with the ACNC for quite some time and worked very closely with community sector organisations as we were looking at the data that organisations not only reported, but at VCOSS we've worked with the ACNC to look at how that data is collected, but also how can we do the Victorian slice of that data, if you like, because traditionally in our advocacy work, we've relied very heavily on anecdotal information, which just isn't that effective when you've got a member of the treasurer, or, so it's around how we can provide that combination of hard evidence alongside the stories, which are incredibly compelling, because together they make a very, very powerful story. And for us at VCOSS, working with all of you, I think some of the key roles we've got to play is that we need to advocate for the volunteer data to be collected annually, because it hasn't been. So it was collected in the first survey that we collected from 4 years ago, not for the following two, and that has been again in the most recent one. And we actually need to be able to track what is the participation of volunteers when we look at the not-for-profit sector, because we know that's one of the key things that we have in telling the absolute value of the volunteer sector and the critical role that you all play, but also the demand that we're facing. And if you look at our sector overall, when we did the first tranche of the Victorian data, I think we had just under 100,000 workers in our sector. We now have over 160,000 workers in our sector, and that's in the space of 4 years. And we can show as well a huge growth in the volunteer sector as well over that time. And so we need to analyse this data on a Victorian level to inform our state bureaucracy, politicians, and to inform our broader community actually about the value of the community sector overall, but the value of volunteers overall as well. And it's a similar story when we prepare our policy reports and submissions or our annual state budget election platform. We work with all of our member organisations to distill the views of the sector, and particularly paying credit to those again who work in volunteer roles, and we pair them with very much the available data and the case studies, because that's the most effective way to tell our story. So when we did our housing launch last Friday that a number of you may have noticed, may or may not have noticed, one of the great things was we interviewed a gentleman who'd been homeless through no fault of his own. He worked with the SEC, it closed, he wasn't able to get another job, he was homeless for 15 years in rooming houses where people were literally murdered. Someone gave him a house and it changed his life. He's now doing volunteer work. He's the crossing supervisor outside Strathclyde Girls' School, and he came along to tell his story on Friday about what the difference that it made when he was able to have a roof over his head. And for us to be able to tell that story alongside the data was the most powerful way we had of being able to provide evidence there. So we present that evidence to government and to policymakers, and it'll be very much to shape policy outcomes. So that's why I know it's so crucial to recognise, support and to invest in volunteering. And that includes assistance for the nearly 30 volunteer support organisations that provide such a pivotal role in guiding and advising organisations and the clubs who use volunteers. And it also does mean greater clarity and certainty for the volunteering sector when it comes to legal protections and requirements as well. So I know that that is particularly challenging too. And one of the central advocacy positions of Volunteering Victoria is for our state to have a whole of government volunteering sector policy. And we join with you in calling for that as well. It's been fantastic to recently see, and all credit to Gab as well in terms of the recent carer strategy, which is brilliant, and I think we'd all love to see a volunteering strategy as the next step as well. So we endorse that position wholeheartedly. So I very much look forward to working with Volunteering Victoria in terms of the next stages of the journey in Volunteering Victoria, whichever party forms government later this year, and to ensure that our volunteers, all of you, are given the assistance that you need to continue the really critical role that you play for the whole Victorian community, because I really think it can't be understated. And I want to thank you for the enormous privilege that it is to be here today, because it very much is, and I want to thank you for your work, because when you look at the work of volunteers on the ground, we know that all of the work that you do makes such a critical difference to our Victorian community, and as I mentioned earlier, it's very much about the social fabric of our community and it's thanks to everyone in the room and all the other volunteers in the state that we have that. So on that note, I would like to leave it, and thank you very much. I really look forward to it.
Wow, isn't Emma brilliant?
Yeah.
Thank you. Hopefully that set the scene for what is going to be the next part of our session this afternoon. This morning, keeping that wrong. So we're very lucky to have 4 MPs across the 2 legislative bodies of Victorian politics able to come and speak with us this morning to talk about their party's position on volunteering, what they've seen and heard about the volunteering sector, their responses to the priorities that we've put in front of everybody this morning, and then most importantly, to hear from you. What is it that you want the MPs to hear? What is it that they can tell you that is going to support them with their journey to make volunteering as effective as possible? So I'm going to invite them up one at a time as I read their bio, because we're going to need to get them kitted up with their microphones. So starting with the incumbent parliamentary Secretary for Carers and Volunteers is Gabriel Williams. Gabrielle was elected to represent the district of Dandenong in the Victorian Parliament in November 2014. In December 2014, Gabrielle was appointed as Parliamentary Secretary for Carers and Volunteers. Gabrielle has also served as the Parliamentary Secretary for Industry and Employment before being appointed to the Parliamentary Secretary for Health in 2016, while retaining the Carers and Volunteers portfolio. Before entering Parliament, Gabrielle completed a Bachelor of Laws and Arts Hons at Monash University, going on to practice as a solicitor in a large Melbourne law firm. She has also worked as an advisor in both state and federal governments and served as a director of a not-for-profit disability sport organisation. Immediately prior to being elected, Gabrielle worked as a project manager to the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Melbourne. Gabrielle is married with 2 cheeky rescue pups and loves sport, including soccer, baseball, Gaelic football, and AGM. We'll have to tell you that is later. In her spare time, she likes to paint, read, and explore the wonderful array of cuisines on offer in the multicultural Dandenong community. Welcome, Gabrielle. Next up is Cindy. Cindy McLeish was elected as the member for Seymour at the 2010 Victorian state election. Following the 2014 election, Cindy was elected as the inaugural member for the new electoral district of Eildon. Cindy also serves as the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Environment, Communities and Volunteers. Prior to entering Parliament, Cindy was a senior consultant for a leading consultancy firm working in the area of organisational effectiveness and leadership capability. Her clients included companies ranging from family-owned businesses, government departments, national and global-based firms. Cindy was also the CEO of Women's Golf Victoria for a number of years. In her early working life, she was also a secondary school maths and science teacher and continues a passion for ensuring young people can reach their potential through a strong education. Welcome, Cindy. Next, we have Samantha Ratnam. Samantha has been a social worker for over 15 years in the fields of drug and alcohol rehabilitation, international development, family services, and most recently in settlement services for newly arrived migrants from refugee backgrounds. Along with her role on council, Samantha has worked as the Program Manager of Client Services at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. She holds a Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Social Work with honours, and a PhD in Youth Sociology. In 2017, Samantha became a member of the Legislative Council in the Victorian Parliament and the Parliamentary Leader of the Victorian Greens. Welcome, Samantha. Last but certainly not least is Fiona Patten. Fiona is the founder and leader of the Reason Party, an evidence-based progressive political movement committed to delivering real change to the Victorian state. In November 2014, Fiona was elected a member of the Victorian Legislative Council for the Northern Metropolitan Region, an electorate of over 500,000 people. She is one of a number of crossbenchers who hold the balance of power in Victoria's upper house. Her decision to run for political office came after 20 years of lobbying for the rights of small business owners, sexual health organisation, sexual freedoms and censorship reform. She was best known as the CEO of Australia's national adult goods and services lobby group, the Eros Association. In 2009, frustrated with the lack of social change on censorship, drug law reform, euthanasia and marriage equality, she founded the Australian Sex Party with her partner Robbie Swan. In August 2017, the Australian Sex Party was dissolved to make way for reason, a movement of common sense. Since being elected, Fiona has garnered respect from all sides of the political divide, and has worked tirelessly to deliver legislative reforms that many thought impossible. Welcome, Fiona. Wow, what a panel. Incredible talent, and we're very lucky that these are the women that are representing us. We also acknowledge 3 apologies that came from parts of the state that I'm currently unfamiliar with. One in Shepparton, the lady up there, my apologies. Warrnambool, Susanna Sheed, Werribee, sorry, and one more. Warrnambool, okay, thank you. So look, panel members will have 5 minutes each to talk to their position, their party's political position on volunteering, to respond to the election priorities, and to anything else related to volunteering that fits within their 5 minutes. They will get a bell at 5 minutes. That is their polite way of cutting off. If they go 30 seconds over, they'll just keep dinging until they realise that we need to move on to the next person. Yeah. So, without further ado, first of all, we welcome the incumbent Parliamentary Secretary for Carers and Volunteers, Gabriel Williams, to lead us off. Kia ora, welcome.
Thank you. Do you want to sit up from here, or do you want us to come up there?
Wherever you want to go.
I might come up there to speak. To start. Nice enough to turn it off. It makes me look like I've got sunlight. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to address you today, and to my parliamentary colleagues for being here as well. It's the nice thing about the election cycle is that we can all be together and hopefully find some areas of commonality. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and any other elders we have here with us today, and a warm welcome to Scott as the new CEO, your first AGM here, as well as the board, and I know Angela Steach is here and Bronwyn is here as well, and all of you for being here and a part of it too. The government recognises the vital importance of volunteering to Victoria and supports the volunteering community in a number of ways. And I'm going to cut straight to that because I'm very conscious of my time and that bell. And those ways include, for example, the existence of my position in itself, the Parliamentary Secretary for Volunteers, a dedicated focus on volunteering in the Victorian Government that can work across portfolios and silos that we know are a reality in governments, not just in Australia, but all over the world. Another aspect that we support the volunteering community in is through recognising and celebrating the work of volunteering in the annual Premier's Volunteer Champion Awards. This provides a wonderful opportunity to put the enormous contribution of Victoria's volunteers on centre stage and to say thank you from the government on behalf of all Victorians to the many volunteers that we have in Victoria, about 1.5 million as a conservative estimate. We've also established, and it's been running for a few years now, the Ministerial Council for Volunteers, which provides strategic policy advice on how best to support and strengthen volunteering in Victoria. And this council has met regularly, as I've said, over the last few years, and has provided some excellent insight and guidance into how to advance and enhance the Victorian volunteer community, which in turn has helped to inform government policy direction, and I'll touch on that shortly. And really the final way that we've supported volunteering, in addition to all the normal funding the government provides to volunteer organisations across a number of areas, whether it be emergency services or the environment or education, you name it, there's a lot of ongoing funding that happens behind the scenes in government. But in addition to that, it's a strategic support for volunteering that stems from the advice coming out of that Ministerial Advisory Council. The reason we do this is pretty simple. Alongside its economic value, and I'm always reluctant to talk about the economic value of volunteering because we know it's so much more than that, but the figure is impressive, and so I'll use it nonetheless. Volunteering is estimated to be worth up to $42 billion per annum by 2021. That's just in the Victorian economy. That's enormous. And we know that volunteering provides really valuable benefits for our entire community and for the individual volunteers. It enhances social inclusion, it strengthens community resilience, It can be a pathway to employment. It can provide physical and psychological benefits to volunteers themselves. We know that volunteers are, in general, happier people. So why wouldn't we want to promote it? And in recognition of Volunteering Victoria's unique role in supporting volunteers and also volunteer managers and volunteer organisations, the government provides funding to Volunteering Victoria totalling it's over $870,000 over the next 4 years to 2021, or over the coming couple of years. Now this includes funding for Volunteering Victoria's State Awards program, an event partner supporting support for Volunteering Victoria's biennial state conference as well, and a range of activities that Volunteering Victoria conducts, which we know help support the broader volunteering community. And in the last state budget in 2018, we included an investment, a very strategic investment of $500,000 over 2 years to support the Victorian volunteer community through leadership training and application of technology. Now, this investment is informed by and implements directly a number of key initiatives that were outlined in the strategic priorities of the Ministerial Advisory Council for Volunteers, which includes a training and mentoring program for volunteer managers, which aims to support access to professional development opportunities for managers of volunteers, and to encourage broader implementation of best practice management approaches in line with the national standards for volunteer involvement. Now, the other part of the component of that funding was a digital literacy and technology readiness program, which assists organisations in improving their capacity to adopt and effectively apply digital and technological approaches to support and to build their volunteer workforce. There are a range of volunteer platforms that exist. They have a variety of different functionalities, but what we know is that they can greatly improve the interface with volunteers, but they can also greatly improve the governance and the back-end information they provide to organisations. So that's certainly a frontier that we hope to be able to plumb the depths of a little bit further. Was that the 5 minute mark? I'll conclude then by saying, really frightening. I'll conclude then by saying a re-elected Andrews Labor government will be continuing the work of the MAC, a new and improved Ministerial Advisory Council, this time with a more strictly whole of government focus, and it will include representatives from every government department to join with the sector to better inform the government. And finally, that body will be charged with developing a new volunteer strategy to take forward to address many of the challenges that Volunteering Victoria and other organisations have highlighted, and to map a way through and really direct the government on how its investment can best be spent in the years ahead, knowing that our challenges are many and varied, but that ultimately we want more people volunteering, and we want our organisations well supported and able to deliver a meaningful volunteer experience and meaningful impact for the broader community. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. That 5 minutes certainly goes fast, doesn't it? Look, next we'd like to invite Cindy McLeish to address the audience. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you. And the Minister for Multicultural Affairs once used a term, a Nigerian word, which meant all protocols and acknowledgements have been done, and so they won't continue. And I can't remember the word though, but it was a really great word. Thank you everybody for allowing me to speak today. As we know, volunteerism is widespread. We see it daily. We heard Emma before say that 80% of community services organisations are supported by volunteers, and we know how important they are to the fabric of our society. Certainly being a country member of Parliament from Eildon, and I had a little bit of difficulty pronouncing that, and we see volunteers on the ground all the time, as do they're more visible, I suppose, and we see them supporting organisations, we see them running organisations, we see them running, the picnic races, for example, that a lot of people go to visit, we see them running land care, but they're also in communities of management, supporting government-owned land and buildings, and also local councils. And one of the things that really stands out for me, though, is I'm not convinced the wider community really understand the extent and nature of volunteerism. Now, we have had volunteer awards. Gabrielle talked about awards, and they've been going on for a long time. Lots of government departments have their volunteer awards, but I'm not sure that that goes far enough, because too many times I hear people who are volunteers disrespected and perhaps treated as though they are paid employees. And the one example that really comes to mind was an SES worker in the country had hiked an hour or so with others into Cathedral Range to help a school that a kid had fallen and had a broken leg. And the teacher turned around and said to him, "Well, you're all right, you're all on overtime." And he said, "No, we're volunteers." And I was horrified that a teacher did not know that our emergency services, our SES workers, are actually volunteers. Now, they're obviously supported by paid employees, and I didn't think that was good enough. So one of the things that from that I have driven with the Victorian Coalition is to have much more of a whole of government promotion and recognition campaign. We have National Volunteer Week, but that week and the week prior, we want to have a coordinated media campaign, online, radio, TV, to promote all volunteers, all of government, so that the wider community really understand who are volunteers. Is it the volunteers doing the reading recovery in schools? Is it helping out in the hospital, holding the hand of somebody who's having cancer treatment? Is it somebody who's sticking a whole lot of plants in the ground for land care? I don't believe that people fully understand the nature of volunteerism. We know in this room, we know the statistics, we all know, but I think that there's certainly room for the broader community. Also, other key platforms of the coalition to support our volunteerism. We don't believe that the emergency services sector, the firefighters in particular, have been treated well. We've had some 60,000 volunteers, and that number is diminishing. They are worried about their future. They're worried about what it means for them, and we'll certainly be supporting them. We want to have a Royal Commission so that respect, that we make sure that they are fully respected. Because we see the other emergency services organisations, Marine Safety, SES, St John's, the Council of Churches, also wondering what it means for them, any changes in that area. So we know that a lot of these people are feeling quite demoralised, and we can't afford as a community to have demoralised volunteers. It's also important that we don't have barriers in place for people who want to volunteer. We live in a society driven by compliance. It gets more every day. People are filling in more forms. It's more and more tricky, and there needs to be platforms available to reduce that the amount of compliance that organisations have to undertake and the hurdles that they have to jump. There are things that must happen, obviously, with our working with children. Couldn't be more important, but we can't put so many barriers in place that we have to have systems and processes that work across the sectors to allow us to embrace and grow the numbers of volunteers. Just a couple of quick commitments that we've made already. Within the autism sector, there's a whole bunch of autism support groups, many volunteer driven, and we're committing $500,000 to supporting those who do the hard work and who also advocate. St Kilda Mums, a lot of you would know that they've expanded into Geelong and Eureka Mums. They want to expand into Frankston as well. They support mums who are doing it tough by reconditioning and delivering furniture, baby goods, all sorts of things. And they're a fabulous organisation. We're certainly looking to support them as well. And the healthcare sector are very keen to have roundtable discussions where they are front and centre with the Minister. And they exist already, but we want to ensure that every year that there is the roundtable focusing on volunteerism, and they're very keen to have some research done into the sector, the health and aged community services sector, and I know that was coming at a cost of about $55,000, and we're happy to support that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Next, we'd like to invite Samantha. Samantha's Ratnam. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you here this morning. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my deep respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was never ceded. It is truly a pleasure to be addressing you here today. A lot of people ask me how I got into politics in the first place and how I ended up in a position of leadership. And I would say that the answer to that question is volunteering. Since my family and I migrated here from Sri Lanka as kids, we benefited so much from the welcome and opportunity that was afforded us. I felt compelled to give back. As someone who was interested in a career in social work, I knew that even in a place like Australia or Victoria, where we have so much, that there are too many that miss out, that are left behind, and that are disadvantaged by systems stacked against them. I knew there were issues that we had to tackle, like poverty, inequality, and climate change, if the next generation were to have a future. Having come from a place that was marred by war, I saw what happened when our community and our governments are not strong and when they're not healthy. So at the earliest possible opportunity that I had, I put my hand up to become a volunteer. At 18, having finished my first year of uni, having the summer holidays before me, I volunteered at the Smith family as a full-time volunteer over those 6 weeks. I then went on to the Mission Streets and Lanes, which now become Anglican, Eating Disorders Victoria, and then became a political volunteer with the Greens. But I have to say, the most formative volunteering experience that fundamentally changed my life was being a volunteer for 5 years on the Margaret Oates Collingwood Soup Van. Every week, the soup van, still to this day, rolls out to the streets of Collingwood, Richmond and beyond to provide food and social support to so many people from all walks of life. Through that experience, I truly learned and faced what poverty in Australia actually looks like. It changed how I saw my home. It changed how I saw my place in our community and what I wanted to do for my future. When I first, as a young, fresh social worker, newly out of university, with not a lot of experience, apart from my volunteering experience under my belt, went to get my first job at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation service. The CEO of the time then said it was your volunteering experience that got you the job. We knew that by being both at university, school and volunteering, you could juggle multiple activities at the same time and do okay. And that's what volunteering enhances in each and every one of our lives. I joined the Greens too, which is a volunteer organisation to help out. And volunteering has given me more than I ever thought possible. More than I think I've actually given back. And I'm truly, truly grateful. I want to thank Volunteering Victoria for the incredible work that you do to support volunteers, to help them navigate the often complex pathways there are to volunteering, to build capacity, advocacy, and build pathways to engender more volunteering throughout our community. I'm proud to lead a party, the Greens, who have a vision for a strong and supported community. But we know that there are fundamental challenges to volunteering, and so many of you have to persevere and navigate through them every single day. Those are things like insecure work, which means that you can't be guaranteed of your hours of work and therefore can't structure volunteering opportunities like you might have in previous time. There are demands on young people's lives to work, to study, to fill every single minute of their day trying to get ahead in a system that is increasingly stacked against young people. Where is the time to volunteer? I commend Volunteering Victoria on your state election priorities, and from the outset I want to say that you have the Green support fundamentally on your platform. We support a whole of government volunteering sector policy, developing a policy that will help deal with fragmentation that we see in the system. We support a volunteering specific portfolio. It's really important that governments prioritise volunteering and recognise just what a fundamental role they play in our communities. We support making it easier to volunteer and to lead volunteers. One of my last jobs before I entered Parliament was at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, and as many of you know, that is a fundamentally volunteer-driven organisation. It meant, as a manager of the Client Services Program, with only a staff of 6 people, that we could service 400 to 600 clients at any one time. And for any of you who know that, a staff team of 6 to be able to reach that many clients is virtually impossible, except by having volunteers, which was fundamental to us in a sector that received very little support. We support building the capacity for volunteer management at the local level and continue the strategic investment and resources as you have asked for. And we're happy to explore making it easier to get volunteers in your organisations, to reducing those costs. And we support providing strong protections for volunteers in state legislation through a number of the really great ideas that we've outlined in your platform. Once again, very proud to lead a party that puts people before profits, community before corporate interests. We want to see a strong and thriving community. I often say that the community service sector is like the glue that holds us together as a community. And I'd say that volunteers are the thing that makes it really stick. So thanks everyone. It's great to be with you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Finally, invite Fiona to the platform here. Thank you, Fiona.
I too feel taller up here. I would also like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and particularly any Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people here today. I'm here because of volunteering, really. In fact, you know, if it hadn't been for volunteers helping me in my campaign, volunteers that I spent at Coburg Station this morning. Yes, hello, and nice to see you. I knew I saw you from somewhere. Coburg Station. Well, we didn't get kicked off, which was very nice. I was quite surprised by that. But my mother, we travelled a lot as children. We moved every couple of years. And the first thing my mother did was get us into at least 3 sports and at least 1 craft and at least 1 volunteer position. She saw that as how to put yourself into the community and how we could meet new friends and become part of that community as quickly as possible. So my first volunteer job was teaching swimming at 12. I became a day camp counsellor. I worked in an aged care facility. I helped out in a whole range of areas. As I got older, I worked on needle exchange programs. I worked at the AIDS councils. I worked with disability services, all in a volunteer capacity. And I loved every second of it. And I know that it was the way my mother also connected when she moved to a new city. It was the way she was able to connect and get to know people and feel part of that community, whether it was through church volunteering or through our school or wherever it was. Now, we also know that volunteering makes people happier and healthier, whether it's the volunteers themselves or the people providing those services. And both Cindy and Gabrielle touched on the amount of money or the economics and the vital part that volunteering brings to our state. And $42 billion a year is quite an extraordinary number. And I think it's certainly something that, as Cindy said, we need to be telling that story more broadly. As Gabrielle said, we need to be seeing that, and I would like to see that in our government's performance measures. You know, how are they assisting volunteers? Let's see some base rates. Let's see how they are providing support. And I know we have a Ministerial Council, but I'd like to see some performance measures on that. What are the outcomes? What are the objectives? What are we planning? The fact that volunteer goes across all areas of government, which is why it is really important that it is never seen as just health or just education or whichever area. It can't be siloed. Justice, health, environment, education, the arts. And a volunteer that almost makes me cry nearly every time I speak about it is with the supervised injecting centre that I was able to get a trial established. About 4 weeks ago, we got a volunteer dentist there. So these are for people who are accessing that supervised injecting centre, some of our most marginalised citizens. Some of them would have never had access to dental health. And a volunteer comes in and provides dental health to that community of people every week. And I don't think I ever imagined that that would be a service that we would be able to provide to those, to that part of our community. And it really shows what volunteering can do and those unexpected outcomes that they bring to the lives of our people. Now, I don't have a checkbook, so I'm not going to promise you anything, but I will advocate, and I thank all of the organisations here because you've helped me. I've been a single member in Parliament, which means every portfolio is my portfolio. And all of you in here have provided me with much needed research, advice, evidence, and information about the various issues that you represent, the various parts of our community you represent, and I thank and commend you for that. An area that we are very keen on establishing is a loneliness ministry. And we know that volunteering is an absolutely crucial part in addressing social isolation and the growing social isolation in our community. And I think as a loneliness ministry, again, it would provide a spotlight on social isolation, but also provide a spotlight on what volunteering can do to address the ever-growing social isolation in our community. Just quickly, looking at the priorities that you presented to us, our response in our office is, I won't use the swear words, but it was all sensible stuff. It saves enormous amounts of money and it improves people's lives. And that is what all of you have been doing here, and I thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you all panellists for providing a very comprehensive synthesis of both our priorities and where you're going. So my first question, and in popcorn fashion, which means no specific order, is what did you take away from the other panellists? What is it? God, that's something I would really get behind. What is it that, you know, if I was, dare I say, in opposition, that I was actually, I would still support that because that just really goes with my future vision for volunteering.
Can I start?
I actually really liked what Samantha said about the social glue that social services and services provide, and I thought that was a really good analogy of the strength of all the people in here and the importance of the work that you do that makes our community work in areas that governments couldn't possibly achieve. And in Cindy recognising sometimes that unsung work that volunteers do, that we often forget that person working at the art gallery taking you around is a volunteer.
I'd probably add to that what stood out to me across all four. It's not so much about getting behind any one idea, but that everybody in one way, shape or form endorsed the need for this to be a whole of government approach. I think we all acknowledge that there are silos, it's how I framed it, but I think in different ways you've all touched on that point and how important it is that we get some coherence and some consistency across government when we think about volunteering policy.
Agree with what Gabrielle said. You know, we all drew on a lot of similarities, and I think the support for volunteerism goes without saying that it's extremely important, but we need to make sure that it remains front and centre on the whole of government, all departments. And I think some departments have probably got away with not doing as much as others in promoting and supporting it. I think that probably needs to change too.
And I agree with my fellow panellists. I think there was really broad and strong agreement that volunteering has been part of all our lives in some way, shape or form, a part of every person in his life. And I dare to say every single person in this state's life has been touched by a volunteer. Often we fail to recognise what it actually is. And I think that is also symptomatic of how we look at how societies and communities work. At a time gone by, I reflect back on, and I'm sure everyone has a story here as well, of a mother or a grandmother or a sibling or a parent talking about something they were doing. And I remember my grandmother talking from an early age about all the community activities she was involved in. She never talked about the word volunteering. In this Sri Lankan context, we never had that word in our lexicon. It's just what you did as a member of society. And it's actually something we all do and are a part of. And unfortunately, with the pressures on work and life, get squeezed out. And that's why we probably have to talk about it more explicitly in terms of let's not lose that thing that we know is fundamental to how we organise ourselves as a society. It's fundamental to our well-being, our health and our emotional outlook. And it's really important that we prioritise it, give it that name and put the resources into it as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. On behalf of the cynics in the room, volunteering as a portfolio really rapidly kind of goes down the list of priorities of governments. We see a lot of investment in education, health, welfare, things like that. volunteering just collapses. It's kind of just that poor cousin when it comes to resourcing, financing, and just voice at the table. What is it that you would do to bring your voice and amplify that to your constituent members of your party if you were the government? What is it that we can expect to see from you? Because really, and this is one of my frustrations in New Zealand, is that volunteering was just that's nice portfolio. You know, it was just lovely. And we had one minister that was inside cabinet, so I'm giving a New Zealand perspective, and when he was in cabinet, we saw some fundamental changes for a difference. Unfortunately, he was only there for about 9 months, but when he was inside cabinet, we were on for a ride. What would your party, what would you do on behalf of your party to prop up and bring us back into front and centre to address, you know, the key points that you've said?
If nobody else knows.
You are the government.
Well, that's a big responsibility for one person. Look, I'll kick off on that because you touched on a few really important points and a couple that you and I have spoken at length about, Scott, and they've been wonderful conversations. And really, coming into government in 2014, that very concept was front of mind, because I think what we recognised was there needs to be a cultural shift within government in the way it thinks about volunteering policy. We're familiar with governments know health policy, they know education, they know transport, they're core parts of government functionality. But when you talk about volunteering as a policy, I think it always gets a bit lost between all the divisions of portfolio responsibilities and the fact that it's fractured across so many. And so the original idea behind the Ministerial Advisory Council was to bring some cohesion to that. It was about saying, well, actually, we need to get everybody across government changing the way they think about this, understanding the economic value of what it delivers to our state, but also understanding fundamentally what it means for our communities. That community resilience, that reduction in social isolation, that the benefits to individuals as well from doing that. Now, it is more than worthy of being regarded as a policy area in its own right, but government structures, by definition and in and of themselves, don't necessarily aren't conducive to being able to manage it well, I suppose, across all those different areas, because we know that volunteering pervades pretty much every policy area of government, pretty much every portfolio, there is a volunteering component within it. So how do we bring that all together? And the Ministerial Advisory Council and the designation of a Parliamentary Secretary for Volunteers was a core part of starting that cultural shift, starting to change that culture within government and starting to change the way, not just ministers, which as we know, churn and change, but departments change the way they're thinking about volunteering and how they plan for it in their policy development. To go to the New Zealand example, and apologies, the New Zealand example of a minister, I'm somewhat of a convert on this, in that at the start of the term I would have fully agreed with there needing to be a minister. Over time and watching the way government operates from within, I've probably formed a view that it's better off being a parliamentary secretary for a couple of reasons. One, if it's in a ministerial portfolio, more often than not it's going to be thrown in among a range of other portfolios, meaning that it's the attention and the time that it can get from a minister is much reduced. It becomes a part of a big mix. And two, that as a parliamentary secretary you can more fluidly operate across departments and departmental structures, whereas as a minister you're usually pretty confined to your own department, so you're embedded within one part of the bureaucracy, not all of it. And so I probably tend to support it being in a parliamentary secretary role and having a minister that champions that in cabinet, which is the current arrangement that we've got. I'm always happy to hear alternatives to that, but I think that that's a mechanism that we could certainly beef up, move forward, and certainly with a revised MAC that brings all those departments to the table as well.
Thank you.
Following from what Gabrielle said, the Coalition also had a shadow parliamentary secretary role for volunteerism, which hadn't existed previously, and I don't think there had been the PARSEC for volunteers prior either. And what it does allow us to do is exactly what Gabrielle said, is to work across all portfolios. And this for me was particularly relevant when we were drafting policy and looking at what sorts of things we need to do. I was able to engage very strongly with policy groups of people to talk about the volunteerism and to make sure that in fact, it was the leader of the opposition who was the champion for me in the cabinet room about pushing policy around volunteerism to make sure that all departments were thinking about it, and when we're looking at the whole of government promotional response, that was very, very positively received, because when the ministers or shadows stop to think about it, yes, there are volunteers in my area, but they often don't get thought about because there's so many other things going on. So I think that it certainly allowed me, the current system, to do a lot of influencing. And I look at it also in, say, departments, and I've worked quite a lot with public health volunteers. And if you talk to a CEO of a hospital or the board of the hospital and ask them what they're doing in terms of volunteers, it gets them to stop and think, oh, hang on, we are doing something, let me just, oh yes, it's in our annual report, we do this, we do that. But it's engaging, you know, at the higher level in all areas to making sure that they understand and recognise and promote the work that volunteers do.
Thank you, Fiona. Sorry, Cindy.
So I totally agree in terms of the premise that we have to move volunteering from being an afterthought, which is often relegated to be a feel-good thing you add on to core to what we do. We know it is already core, but it deserves that attention and acknowledgement, and there's all sorts of ways to do that in a parliamentary portfolio way. But I'd like to talk about resourcing. So we know that one of the areas that there are the most significant gaps to really scaling up volunteering is the resources that organisations have to support volunteers, and it does take resources to support volunteers. So for example, I know working in the community service sector, when you have 1 to 2 year contracts, where you can't plan for your staff retention, let alone your volunteer retention, those things have to change. Love contracts to building volunteer coordination expenses and costs within those contracts, because we know it does take extra resources, and often organisations have to scrounge around for little bits of money left over here and there to put towards a volunteer coordination person or unit to be able to actually scale up their volunteer resources. Investments in big sectors like housing, mental health, health, education, and the list goes on. It's one of the reasons, as the Greens were really focused on supporting those big sectors, because we know a lot of the volunteering and support work and the enhanced work that needs to occur are in these really significant and core sectors for our community. So I'd really like us to have a really significant conversation about how we resource organisations more to really utilise and build the capacity to bring volunteers into organisations.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I very much agree. I think when you look at this, when we look at the value of volunteering, we say it's valued at $42 billion a year, yet we don't see it mentioned really in our budget papers at all. We don't see it measured in any real way in our across government budget. So taking on from, I think Gabrielle's good point that putting it into a ministry may actually silo the portfolio, but keeping it across all portfolios. But let's see some reporting across those portfolios. How did the Health Department or the Environment Department or Justice Department, how did they assist volunteers? How did they play a part in that $42 billion that volunteers brought to this state? How did they do that? And how can we measure that? And I think certainly touching on Cindy saying that when you speak to a hospital, what do you do with volunteers? And oh yes, well let's put that front and centre in our reporting, because it is such a valuable resource, and that we know that it's a give and take as well. We know that the more volunteers that the more people who are volunteering, the better that is for their health and well-being, and obviously the services that volunteers give us. But I would like to see a lot more government measurement of that. And I would obviously like to see that in some of our performance measures. And finally, we do not have long-term planning as a government. I still feel that everything is based on 2-year performance measures, and we should be looking at 10-year performance measures.
Can I just jump onto one of the points? Sorry, I'm blowing away your time schedule. I'm very aware of it. Because it was touched on by 2 of our panellists, which was the health volunteers example in particular. And one of the things that doesn't necessarily get front page of the Herald Sun, but is an achievement that I'm particularly proud of out of the work of the MAC and other advocacy from the health sector itself. And I noticed that we've got Sharon Molshy, who was key to this, but it was about having recognition of volunteers and an accountability around volunteers, including in the statement of priorities for hospitals, which has just been included in hospital statement of priorities, which is a huge achievement and goes to that point of measurement.
Yeah.
but also make sure that hospital CEOs are turning their minds to this and understanding that the government, it sends a very clear signal that the government values this and that it's important and that we're watching to see what they're doing. So we're hoping that that balances out some of the differentiation we've seen between health services, where some are really good with their volunteer components and support it really well, others not so much. Where we've sent a clear signal that we're watching.
And I think, and asking departments to report on that as well, incentivises them to be setting those priorities.
So would you support, so it is in health at the moment, would you support other agencies, departments following on the health, the HHS with their statement of priorities?
I'd like to see them under every single department, because we know that justice, when we look at our prisoner services, so many of those are volunteers. There's so much volunteer work done out there in environment, in infrastructure, in the arts, and let's recognise that. Let's have that as a bottom line. We talk about triple bottom lines in a whole range of areas, and recognising that. So, within the arts portfolio, how many volunteers are they resourcing? And I think that would be great numbers, and it would incentivise people to do that more.
I think that's something there as well. I think it's interesting in terms of how this is quantified and recognised in different sectors as well. So often in the social and community sectors, if you're applying for any philanthropic funding, you'll be asked to state how much pro bono or in-house resourcing will put towards the project, and you're often quantifying your volunteer numbers and volunteer resources that you're garnering, and that's actually valued in that application. Is the same valued in other places where you're trying to secure funding? So it's a kind of fundamental difference of what we value and how we are asked to report it. That changes your attractiveness for funding, because actually we think those philanthropic organisations say, look, they've got a great capacity to bring people in and really amplify their message, which is something that we want to do with this project funding, so therefore we treat them more favourably. Wouldn't it be nice if we had that type of acknowledgement and recognition right across the board, and our budgets just didn't measure success in terms of economic growth and GDP, which are important, but also think about the social resource and capital that we're building as part of every dollar that's invested of public money.
Anything to add, something? You've got, okay, so I've got 100 other questions, but it's not my stage. It's over to you, folks. We've got two roving mics. We've got Vivian in one corner, and then we've got
Adele in the other. Hi, I'm Adele from ARDA. We work with 1,500 volunteers in schools across Victoria. We're very lucky, and we've heard a lot about volunteers in the healthcare and justice environment, which are absolutely crucial, and emergency services. I just wondered if we could hear a couple of words about how our valued, there's thousands more valued potential volunteers can support the education state.
I'm happy to lead off on that. I've certainly visited ARDOC, and I know a number of people who have volunteered helping out in disadvantaged schools, and it's some fabulous work that's being done, and I know with what amount of money is required for them to actually double or triple the amount of work that's required to make a real difference in the lives of some of these kids. I've taken a shadow minister to ARDOC, and he's also visited one of the schools where that program's been running, and it's something that I've been a strong advocate for.
And to draw on that, lovely to see you, Adele. And ARDOC does brilliant work, and I'm a member of a community that has benefited, or the schools that have benefited, the students have benefited from those programs. And for my part, and for the government's part, that there is an extraordinary contribution that volunteers make to our broader education sector, particularly in communities of high disadvantage and communities like mine, where we can sometimes take for granted that parents are in a position to provide that educational support, when that is not always the case. I might have parents who don't speak English, who may not be literate in their own native language, let alone in English, and therefore that education support for kids, even things as simple as being read to, is overwhelmingly in some of these school environments being provided by volunteers. I know there are some streams of funding throughout, through portfolios for those sorts of activities, but certainly something that I'm more than happy to champion and be, I suppose, promoting, because going back to the point that we made previously about how aware the community is that these roles are performed by volunteers, I tend to agree that it's actually probably pretty low in a lot of these areas, that there's not a great awareness publicly of the fact that these programs are running, that they are supported by volunteers, and of the impacts that they're achieving. And so I specifically have spoken to Minister James Molino about ARDOC before, and about the work that you perform and the benefit it's had in my community. I know he's a big supporter as well, and it's about continuing to promote that work.
Thank you, and I think, yes, apologies, education was on my list. We see it every day, and in every school that I visit, whether it's parents helping, or it's retired people coming into the schools and helping with whether it's reading or sports programs or music programs. You know, our education system wouldn't survive without the volunteers. Again, I believe it's about recognition. How do we, in that bottom line, how does James Molino say, and the education department supported this many hundreds of thousands of hours of volunteers in our schools and in our education system, whether that's after school help or helping in disadvantaged areas with homework classes and the like. It's going back to our notion of the loneliness ministry and how we can incorporate that. And what we're seeing in a lot of jurisdictions is how to connect young people who are feeling isolated with older people who are feeling isolated. And I think education is one of those perfect places to start to build that. And that would, if I'm lucky to be re-elected next year, or reasons represented, that's an area we'd like to work on.
And if I can add, hats off Adele and Nada for fantastic work. You've got such an incredible reputation and been doing such incredible work for years. So important in terms of education and recognising all the sectors that drive and build volunteerism and essentially make the other parts of the system work, because the other parts of the system would start collapsing if we didn't have volunteers. Speaking more broadly as well, I think, you know, thinking about where volunteering fits in and often starts, and there are different parts of the volunteering sector, but sometimes we see volunteering spring when there isn't enough resource being allocated to a sector or organisation, and the mandate is so powerful for that work that people just can't look away. So you bring volunteers to do that work, and it actually leads to really interesting and powerful innovation, because suddenly you have the evidence base to say, actually we need to fund this work because look at what we were able to achieve by doing this. So just hats off to all the organisations who just you know, maximise every single resource they have to really meet the needs of the people they support and do some of the most innovative work. So I think there's lots of coins to the volunteering story, and volunteering plays such a fundamental role in hopefully in many ways giving seed then to building a compelling case why governments need to start funding things a bit more as well.
Vivian, and then next person.
Thank you for the commitment and the feeling that we've all landed on the same sort of platform of having whole of government strategy for volunteering. And I guess given Scott stole my two questions, I'm actually probably going to...
And you, Scott.
Leave it.
I'm probably going to make a comment and ask for your feedback on it. Because one of the things that strikes me is that yes, there's lots to achieve in coordination at whole of government and whole of government strategy. There is equally a lot to get from whole of community coordination, and whole of government strategy needs place-based coordination of volunteering in communities to bring and share the resources. You've talked about health, you've talked about education, there's tourism, there's land care, there's all of us, all recruiting, all training. You know, place-based coordination of the assets of communities, in bringing those together is a fundamental part of coordinating volunteering as the whole of government, and I'd be interested in your views on that.
If you like. Thanks very much. That's a really fantastic comment. Very happy to provide some feedback on, and I think it is fundamentally often missing when we talk about how we coordinate this better to enhance volunteering. As a local councillor, I remember I was often asked the question first. People would call up and say, I want to volunteer for this organisation in Moreland, how do I do it? And they looked at us as elected representatives to be the coordinator, and it made me realise that there was a lack of any other coordination place, so they didn't know where else to turn than to speak to the elected representative. And that was a fine place because it meant that we could then recognise the gap and talk to within our council about what we could do as a local government to provide that kind of place-based, localised network of coordination as well. Once again, local governments also often in this bind of having not the resources they would ideally like to do that coordination, but I would love to see us exploring and talking about how local governments could play a role, because they're fundamentally positioned there. They have the antenna and tentacles already out in the community. Most organisations, even if they don't get local government funding, are connected to the local council in some way. So I think that would be a fantastic starting point of us formalising that kind of network of coordination at a place-based stage.
Probably also highlights the importance of VSOs and the DVSN in our state. And I've alluded before alluded to the funding that was handed down in the last budget, a part of which was the volunteering and or the training and mentoring program for volunteer managers, which aim to support access to senior opportunities and the like. And that is very much targeted around projects that are directed to rural, regional and metro. It targets VSOs, so those who know those areas best, really, and who are most well placed to be able to, I suppose, tell government what works best in their community. What works in Warrnambool may not be what works in Dandenong. What works in Geelong may not be what works in Echuca. And we're very receptive to that. We need to be more receptive. There's always more we can do, but about making sure we're using the expertise on the ground. I know another thing that came out quite heavily in the MAC, particularly for small and medium-sized organisations who are looking for resourcing, was that they're often competing against each other for government grants, which means that it works against collaboration. And that's certainly something I'd like to make a priority working forward, and how we actually better promote collaboration across organisations, particularly where there are geographic synergies and where they may actually be able to complement each other in terms of their service offering as well. So we're not asking every organisation to reinvent the wheel or to add to their offering when they don't have the resources to do so. We're actually facilitating them being able to work with like-minded organisations who do have that offering that they may not have. There's certainly some more work to be done on that.
I think following from Gabrielle when she talks about competing for grants in a lot of small country towns, and I represent many, many country towns that have got between 1,000 and 2,000 people. Not only are they competing for the same grants, they're competing for volunteers. They're trying to all get the same people. And very often you'll see one person on all committees, and then sometimes they're going, not them again, not them again. But yeah, they're the ones who are willing to put their hand up and actually have a real crack and make a difference in a number of different areas. I've spoken to quite a number of different councils about their volunteering programs, and following up what Samantha said, a lot of them have started to do that already. So I think that is certainly a positive. A lot of councils have very, in country areas, very big areas as well. But looking at the sorts of things that Eastern volunteers do, I think it's really important to make sure that we do have places like that that can support people who want to volunteer and help them find the paths where they fit best. Because sometimes we see this often, that people volunteer in a particular organisation and it's not the right fit, just like a regular job. Sometimes you know you're in the wrong spot, and it might take them a couple of different places before they find where they land and it's the right place for them, and they might give 6, 7, 20 years as dedicated service.
Yeah, I certainly think peak bodies like Volunteering Victoria can play such an important role in providing that service to the other volunteer organisations, and this is where government should be assisting there, because again, not reinventing the wheel, but if you can provide your members with a service that enables them to much more easily manage and recruit their volunteers and possibly share those volunteers in a more meaningful way, I think that's great. I also like a lot of the priorities that you're putting in simplifying things like, or making free checks and balances for your volunteers. I think those are very good priorities, and those are really simple ways that governments can help in a very practical sense. I would be very interested to hear other ways that governments can assist in very practical ways to make it easier for the organisations to manage and recruit their volunteers.
My name is Ron Kolan. I'm Yeah, my name is Don Colan. I'm a CEO of a company called Crosswalk, and we've been very fortunate to work with the Australian Red Cross over the last year and a half. We basically built a digital platform that helped them manage their volunteers, literally from the recruiting all the way to managing, working online, and then feedback and putting them back in the cycle. Now, we've also, as part of the Red Cross Target 2020, they're really focusing on getting corporates. And I've been fortunate to have a discussion with the UNAA, Australian Association, and they say it's a challenge for them as well to really get corporates into putting volunteers. Now, we sit in a building by NAB. We know in Melbourne, if you look around things, obviously a big part of Victoria is those big corporates. They have probably they can have the most immense amount of impact on volunteering. NAB volunteer 2 days per employee. Multiply that 50,000 people, that's a lot of volunteering. I haven't heard a word about corporate volunteering today so far. The second thing I really would like to acknowledge that we mentioned measuring volunteering, and that's something that we as a software company wanted to measure volunteering impact, and then we kind of learned that there is a framework, it's called SDGs around the world. I haven't heard any, maybe a challenge from Victoria to come and say we're going to be measuring in a global scale through the SDGs, and then compare it versus it's compared to other states or compare it even internally. For example, how much does actually the state of Victoria do as an impact compared to corporates? Are we better? Are we less? It would be great to see an actual measurement, a framework which is being embraced globally and then compared internally, and then bring the corporates in with all this immense amount of power they have, and to see what they can really help us. So I'd like to hear your points of view about how we can have that.
Thank you. Federation has, to go back to 1901, has presented us with some challenges about getting agreements nationally, let alone globally, on how we measure things and how we contrast. But I'd take your general point around getting some consistency and then being able to compare across jurisdictions. You know, that's, I noticed that there was in the Volunteering Victoria priorities a point around, it was specifically around the Working with Children check scheme, but it made the broader point around Victorian government prioritising work towards a nationally consistent scheme. Well, that could actually apply across many things, and particularly the measurement scope that Fiona's been talking about as well. I think there is certainly room for us to do some work through those channels like COAG and other national channels that we have to try and get a better focus on how we, as a country, deal with volunteering and measure our volunteering impact and output. In terms of the corporate volunteering space, and again, it sits in the private sphere, so that doesn't mean there's no levers within government, but it's probably less levers, but it does actually raise an important question about our own workforce. The governments are, or the public service, governments are the biggest employers, among the biggest employers in the state through the public service, so there's certainly lessons we can take away and some things that we can probably learn from the corporate sector and apply to the public service in terms of how we promote and facilitate volunteering within our own workforces. And to go to your point about platforms, I mentioned earlier that part of the strategic investments coming out of the Ministerial Advisory Council's priorities at the last budget was a digital literacy and technology readiness program, which really was built around the existence of these platforms, and you're obviously very familiar with the one that you've developed, and as I said in my opening remarks, there's many of them, but we really want to open those up to organisations to be able to use to work out what works best for them, and how that might actually enhance on two ends, their engagement with volunteers and their ability to recruit and retain, but also their ability to gather that information, which in turn not only gives them an insight into their impact and improves their governance, but also helps them in their application for government grants because they're able to actually prove or evidence that impact to show what they've been able to do in a way that is much more difficult without that sort of technology. So we're trying to, I suppose, jump a hurdle and see whether that's a good space for government to be in terms of facilitating organisations' access to this technology and to the skills that are needed to navigate it. It really marks a shift in thinking in terms of how governments think about their place in the volunteering world. I think we've toyed with all sorts of things in times past which aren't maybe the best place for government to be, and so we need to start being strategic about where our investment should be directed, so that we can, so it's not divided into silos, so that we actually have a sort of for want of a better term, I keep saying the word, but a strategic role in giving organisations and those who support them what they need to be able to move ahead and navigate what is a complex environment.
I've been walked through a number of volunteer management platforms, and I've been really impressed with what they can do and how much easier it can be for organisations who adopt and use those. But I'm also equally aware that there are a number of different systems that are used by a number of different organisations that have large volunteers, and to try and get everybody to move on to, you know, ones that are going to give similar outputs in terms of easy benchmarking is always going to be a challenge. And I've worked as a consultant prior to being elected. We did a lot of employee engagement benchmarking, and we would benchmark the private sector clients and also against the government ones. And that was a huge effort, and it was terrific the work that we were able to do. But you don't have a lot of apples and apples. You know, you've often got apples and oranges, which really makes some of that quite difficult. And as Gabrielle said, you know, within government, there's only a few levers that we can have to actually get the corporates to do what we would like them to do. They're their own bodies.
I think what's just really struck me from this is, you know, I know that our corporations and NAB is a very fine example of that, where they really promote volunteering amongst their staff. It does strike me, and it's something that I'm certainly, if I'm there next year, will certainly look at pursuing, is how government does that. As possibly the largest employer in Victoria, how does government encourage its employees to take on volunteer positions and to do that? And I actually think that that's a really good idea, and it's something that I think is absolutely worth pursuing. I'm not going to talk about platforms and those things, it's out of my pay scale. But pursuing the notion of how we get the government sector involved in volunteering, I think is a great idea.
Great question, thanks very much. Well done on the platform work. I know that goes a long way. So anything that can help manage large volunteer data makes it easier for organisations to onboard volunteers and manage all of that throughout the process goes a long way. So well done for doing that work, and I'm sure it's making a really big difference. In terms of very happy to talk about the role of corporates, and I think corporates could potentially have an even more powerful role to play, and I think they've got a number of things to offer us, and they've got resources in terms of actual money, so actual money to other organisations that are really having significant funding issues and gaps where they're not getting government investment, etc. So a lot more corporate giving would be fantastic, but also we've seen programs piloted through NAB and others where they give staff time, and so we've seen models like the 2 days a year or 1 day a year, and I think it's worth having a broader conversation about how effective these programs are and how to make them even more effective. So think about, as opposed to thinking about it as what we were talking about before, afterthought to core work. So rather than a feel-good thing, just a fundamental thing, and rather there being a relationship between giver and recipient being a partnership. So I think with some of the programs that we've seen, they're kind of tasters, getting people exposed to what volunteering can feel like. I'd actually say the real power and the fundamental change you can get from it is if corporates work in partnership with the other community, education, health, etc. sectors, and think about how do they fundamentally change the conditions where volunteering can thrive. I know at the SRC, we benefited from corporate partnerships with big tier law firms who had the money to really invest in their staff. We benefited from 1, 2, 3 months secondments of their lawyers. They're some of the most highly qualified lawyers who are doing some of those important humanitarian work for people seeking asylum in this country, and that went so far beyond 1 day every year. So it's important to have those things as a funnel to get people interested in volunteering, but I think we should start thinking about partnerships, the secondment opportunities, the swap opportunities, so you go and work in another organisation, you have exposure to another sector, get resources as well. The corporates can really offer that, so I'd really like us to talk about partnerships.
And finally, in terms of changing the conditions where volunteering can really thrive. So reasonable work hours for your corporate employees, so they can say, sorry, I have to leave at 5:30 today because I've got my volunteering gig, and that's okay. Rather than the work pressures, you've got to stay till 8 to finish this really intense job, which is now becoming the norm. And we know those types of things in terms of work conditions, insecurity of work, are really the downward pressures on volunteering as well, because people don't have the time or the resource. So let's ask Corporate Australia to have a conversation with our community sector about how we can really form a partnership that where it becomes fundamental rather than giver and recipient.
Thank you very much. So we're almost out of time, so I'm really sorry, we can't do any more questions. What I want from the panel, in one sentence, because we can't get promises out here, we'd like some promises, but we'll just go with commitments. One commitment for the next 4 years that we can maybe get from you. And I give you maybe as well. So I commit to one thing.
A little bit of start. I think I've already given mine actually in my opening remarks, but I will commit. The re-elected Andrews Labor government will continue to work with the MAC, but in a new improved format which brings to it representation from each department across government with the sector. So we're actually combining the two, and through that we'll develop a new volunteering strategy.
Mine's around the whole of government volunteering to make sure that all the areas of government are thinking about and promoting volunteerism, but also are actively engaged during the week before and during National Volunteers Week to do this very strong promotional campaign.
I commit to accountability in terms of what's been talked about. Very happy to come back this time next year or even before and talk about what work we've taken away from today to put these commitments into action in the next Parliament of Victoria.
I certainly commit to having better performance measures and measuring on how government supports volunteering and across the board. But I also commit to really promoting the notion that volunteering is not only good for the people who are receiving the services from volunteers, but it is so good for our community health to volunteer. We know it's better for your physical health, we know it's better for your mental health. So across the board to promote the idea of volunteering as a health issue for the receivers and the givers.
Excellent. So on behalf of Volunteering Victoria, thank you very much, Gabrielle, Cindy, Samantha, and Fiona. Thank you very, very much. You really helped us get a better picture of what you're going to bring into the election campaign season that is upon us. Good luck with your respective campaigns. Thank you very much. We really do appreciate this. Just one last round of applause for each. Just a little something as you walk off the stage here, so thank you, Fiona.